Hello.
Hello.
Hey everyone.
Yeah, greetings. Well, I think we're all here. Excellent work. Um, Bear with me a second whilst I catch up. And we'll kick off. Okay, so do we have a notes document? Yes, we do. I suppose. Turn my camera on. Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the GraphQL over HTTP working group. Apparently the first one we've had since January. So welcome. By being here, we've all agreed to the membership agreement, the participation guidelines, the contribution guide, and the code of conduct, links to all of which are in the agenda. Gosh, it's late here. I'm getting a bit tongue-tied. We'll start with an introduction of the attendees. There's just the four of us, so we'll go Benji, Martin, Yovi, and Shane. Hi, everyone. I'm Benji.
I'm Martin.
Hey, I'm Yovi.
I'm Shane. Hello.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Okay, so reviewing the agenda, theoretically, we should have a look at the last meeting's action items. And then we have the persisted operation identifiers syntax from Martin. Is there anything else that anyone feels needs to be on this agenda? There is one thing I would like to talk about as well, which is the process of moving this forward, which is mostly on us adding security to the spec. So I'll talk about that if there's time at the end of the meeting. But for now, I'm going to have a quick look at the action items. We have none ready for review. We have one action item, which is to contact Apollo about persisted operations appendix, which was on Yovi. How did that go, Yovi?
I did that. The thing that was the most problematic, from the sounds of it, was the SHA-256 prefix, but they were keen on also moving away from extensions. I am blanking on the name, but someone said that they would comment on the PR, which I don't think they
Okay.
have yet.
David, maybe?
Yes, David, thank you.
Let me
He-
add another thing to the agenda for today as well, then. I'd like to just chat about persisted operations for a bit as well. I'm going to close that action item because it has been done. You have reached out, so that's great. Thank you so much for doing that. And yeah, all input welcome. Okay, so did anyone take... I didn't even invite meeting notes. So yes, please, someone take notes. What were the two things that we wanted to... Oh gosh, yeah.
Oops.
All right, just fiddling with the meeting notes. What were the two things we wanted to talk about as well? It was persisted operations and... Oh, advancing the spec. Perfect. All right, cool. So I will hand over to Martin to talk about persisted operation identifiers syntax. Go ahead, Martin. Your Zoom is muted.
Yes, usual mistake. Sorry about that. Persisted operations, or is it persisted query actually? Like What should we use? I think the official wording is persisted operations, right?
I think it might actually be documents.
Persisted documents. All right. Yes, persisted documents. That's the name of the branch. Good job there. There was this PR open from you, Benji, a very long time ago, and I said, in this comment here, I said a very long time ago that I was going to look at a formal syntax for the operation identifiers because I do love a good formal syntax. And which I did in a follow-up PR, which is just here. So just a quick look. I mean, it's not too much. I think there is general consensus about where this is going. The big question, though, is whether we should restrict the characters used for the identifiers to something like alphanumeric and a bunch of unreserved characters, or just allow anything full Unicode range, because there's no strong reason not to. So funnily enough, I initially started with allowing everything. And then Benji, you sent me, I think, another commit of yours where you went the other way and restricted this a little bit. You had this argument about using identifiers as part of pass URL pass. So encoding this is always possible, but it's nice if it's not encoded. And the thing that really brought me is that it's always easier to relax than restrict the syntax. So the current version of this pull request just allows, so I don't know what we have, layer digits minus dot underscore and tilde. So that's it, and I think it's a good starting point. Allows for base64 if we use a URL encoded version. Allows for GUIDs and allows for, well, obviously checksums. So the question I have for this group today is, what are we forgetting? Does anyone have needs for something else, something that is not captured here? And if not, all good then. I think Shane, you had some objections about that.
I can just give my comments. And so I'm trying to look at this from a perspective of a library designer's perspective. So I don't plan to use any specific identifier pattern myself. I mean, I use databases just like everyone else, and it's either integers or GUIDs or whatever, typically. And but it seemed to me that the identifiers are stored in strings within the JSON payload, and they're just opaque identifiers at that point, just like a file name, a URL path, or whatever. If you wanted to encode it on a URL path, there's already standards for escaping to, if you go to Wikipedia, you can go to Wikipedia / and type in a smiley face. It's actually the name of a page on Wikipedia, a little smiley face character. That's just my perspective. Is just I wasn't really sure why we're restricting the set inside a string that's already got a well-defined encoding mechanism.
So I can speak to this. I think, hello, Sam, you're welcome. Do you want to introduce yourself for a second?
Oh, sure. I'm Samuel. Well, primarily I work on Altair GraphQL clients, and I'm also like one of the maintainers for GraphiQL in the GraphQL GitHub repository. So I'm just dropping by to kind of join the conversation essentially.
Awesome. Welcome.
Yeah.
So as Martin said before, one of the main things that we generally concern ourselves with is if we start in a limited space, we can always expand from there. But if we start with a broad space, you can't then compress it back down again. I think there are also like other concerns. We've got things like zero width joiners, we've got things like surrogate pairs, we've got then encoding issues like whether it's UTF-16, UTF-8, various other things like that, where identifiers may not be as compatible from one operating system to another. And these are things that do need to exist in both places. Like they need to exist on the Mac where the iOS app is being developed, and they need to exist on the, let's say, Linux server where it's being executed. So there are platform concerns here. And without being an expert in the encoding of strings like this, I think if there's no solid use case for enabling additional characters, I don't think we should probably do so. The only one that I think is currently missing from this current proposal is in the vendor prefixed document identifiers, the X dash. I think additional colons should be allowed, because then you can use, I think, URNs, which use colons, a lot of them. But other than that, I think it's all good. And I think I wrote into the chat the reason that I chose these characters was because of the unreserved namespace that is defined in one of the RFCs for HTTP, specifically RFC 3986. So I just based it on that, and then I thought about the other things that we might need. So that was very much the motivation for this.
Is there a defined set of URL characters that are known to be safe and that we might reference? Just allow any URL as a character versus defining our own character list? Or
yes, that is what we've done. We've taken the unreserved characters from RFC 3986.
Okay, so this is the same list then.
Yeah, in mine I actually referenced that with a comment, which I would recommend that you do as well, Martin. Put a little non-normative note there saying that this, you can say is inspired by or whatever, but effectively it is a copy of those. The unreserved character certainly is. If we allow additional ones like colon, I think that's fine, because the point of unreserved is here are the ones you can definitely use, and then there's other ones that are like caveated, and so we can add those if we want to.
So if you add colon, then that means that now we have to be explicit as to whether it's the last colon is the payload or the first colon defines where the payload break is.
Yes, so it's actually already defined quite strictly in the spec text, which is basically if it's a custom document identifier, then it is not allowed to contain a colon. And if it is a prefixed document identifier, then it must contain a colon, and then it can contain any other colons afterwards, and they're just part of the payload at that point.
Right.
And
so I just to clarify, you mentioned that namespaces contained colons or something earlier. And so, I was working on this code the other day, and I was going to pass the prefix and the payload, and we should be explicit as to whether or not, if there's two colons present, whether the first colon is like a namespace for the prefix, and you have a longer prefix with colons in it, or the payload. In other words, either the prefix or the payload should be able to contain colons, but not both.
Yes, correct. The prefix cannot contain colons. Then there is
Okay.
a colon, and then there is the payload, which may
Got it.
contain colons.
Got it. That's fine with me.
Seeing if I can find a nice example URN. Here we go. So I've just written an example into the chat. Oh, hello, David. Do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure. Martin just told me to say hi. Yeah, this is the GraphQL-over-HTTP working group. Yeah, I'm David. I used to be a maintainer on Apollo server, and so did a lot of sort of iterating on making that fit the spec more and vice versa. A few years ago, also worked on some persistent queries related things, both Apollo's sort of enterprise PQ feature, as well as having done a few things on and off over the years on our APQ feature. I had a chat with Jovi a while ago about the RFC and promptly failed to write up my feedback anywhere, which was the intention. Sorry, the intention was to write up the feedback, but did not quite get there.
There's always time.
Remember what it is first, and then find the RFC, and then write it up. And Martin just said that my name got said, and that I should at least say hi. I said, "Well, I am here, so
Yeah,
wait."
welcome. Good to see you.
Yeah.
I actually have a topic that would benefit from your input if you're able to hang around for a few minutes till we finish this current discussion.
Sure.
Perfect. Okay, so Martin, I am in favor of this. You've actually gone about it a slightly different way to how I did. You've actually been a lot stricter in syntax terms. So when I define this in what I'm going to talk about later, I just defined it more in terms of like prefix, colon, and then payload, and then left the remainder of it for validation. Whereas you have made the SHA 256 an explicit syntax, and you've made the X dash an explicit syntax, which is fine. Yeah. Online 118, you should allow colons in there as well. So it wouldn't be an unreserved character you'd use there. It would be unreserved character or colon, for example.
Yes.
But yeah, I just wanted to comment that it is a difference. I'm actually indifferent which way we go with that.
I think actually we had a discussion about SHAS 256 and the number of characters, and we don't have a way in the spec to say that it must be 64 in the parser, so we decided to leave that to validation. So since we are leaving the payload to validation, it might make sense to leave the prefix to validation as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think that works fine for me.
It's more symmetrical, more consistent overall.
Yeah, and it would make future changes easier. And also then we can just refer to it as like prefix and payload. And then we can just say prefixes are either things that we explicitly support, or they are X dash and then some characters that do not contain a colon.
Perfect.
Okay, awesome. Sounds good to me. I think you've got the feedback that you need on this. Yeah, brilliant. Awesome. Good to see this coming together. Okay. So I'm trying to work out where there we go. So we'll move on to I'm actually going to skip ahead to advancing the spec to get David's input on this. The spec, as far as I see it, is the base spec, excluding the persisted documents stuff, is basically ready to go and is basically what everyone already does anyway. It's what's implemented in GraphQL-HTTP, and we have the GraphQL-HTTP test suite, which has checked, I think, all of the major vendors, or most of them anyway, and everyone is pretty much compliant. So I think the spec is basically ready to go. But The one caveat that we have is we should address security concerns. Now, we need to be sensible in the way that we do this, because we don't want to like repeat everything in the HTTP spec, for example. We also don't want to necessarily have to link out to each individual thing. So I'm not exactly sure the best way to go about doing this. Yeah, does anyone have thoughts on what the best approach for this is?
For someone who is a bit new to the topic, what's under security? I know there was a question about cores and the specific header. Is that what we are talking about, or are we talking more about like semantics of post and general HTTP things?
I think we're talking about everything, like anything that someone who wants to implement the spec might need to concern themselves with. And that, like for HTTP, is such a broad topic. It does cover those things. My preference would be that we effectively say, you know, this has all the standard HTTP concerns, plus where we have done things in this way, you need to be aware of these specific things. I think that's probably the best way, but if other people have other thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
It seems similar to what gRPC does. They also just mention like HTTP2 spec and the TLS versions.
That's a really great call out to look at prior art. What have other people done? Yeah, fantastic. Can you share a link to that?
Yep. Give me one. It's now in the chat. At the bottom, there's a security thing.
That is a very minimal commentary.
Exactly. I'm not sure like if we're building off of HTTP, I think it's healthy to just mention that and then continue on the specifics that we layer on top. I think that's healthy for a spec.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. So there are like where we've left things as shoulds rather than musts, and mays, for example, where we've said you can use other encodings if you want to. I think this is one of the things that David called out way back, which is like we don't specifically list these other media types, but if you were to use them, then you open your door to like various cause issues and information disclosure. So though we don't tell people to do that, we do allow them to do that. And because of that looseness in the wording, we should maybe have a little caveat saying, if you leverage this, then, you know, on your head be it. I'm not sure that we should explicitly try and list all of the security implications of doing something, but we could give an example, like be aware that this may have security implications, for example, cause or whatever.
Shouldn't the sorry.
I was just going to comment. I'm in agreement. I think that there's probably two specific notes that we may want to point out. One being just the nature of get versus post and the security implications there, and one being, you know, CORS requests and the potential that if you don't follow all the recommendations, you know, you could you know, have those I'm not saying it right, but there could be a security issue due to a CORS you know what I mean? I'm missing my words right now, but you know, I think those are probably the two biggest concerns that are unique to GraphQL. That's, and then I would go with something very short and sweet, pointing to other documents. Is my suggestion.
So we do already have the requirement that get must not be used for mutations, which is, yeah, a really key one and really important. That isn't even an option for the user. It's like literally, no, you do that, you're not GraphQL, which is great. But yeah, I think calling out the others is wise. Samuel, I think you were going to say something.
I was basically going to say exactly that. Like, shouldn't the spec be more strict in terms of what people should be able to use? Essentially, like, content type, application JSON, and the other things, which would essentially limit the kinds of security concerns that we'll be thinking about, and then it might be possible to just add those, few things to the spec itself in the, should or maybe kind of version.
That's actually, yeah, I'd need to reread the spec text, but I think that's a really good point. By saying that they may use other encodings, what we're effectively doing is stopping ourselves from using those encodings in future as officially supported encodings, because someone may already have used them and done them in a different way. So being stricter here might be better, because then we can open it up in future, rather than at the moment we're quite lenient. This might be something worth passing by Dennis, because he's got a much better handle on the various implementations and whether they use different encodings. I think traditionally there's quite a few encodings that I used that we don't have in the spec, that we wouldn't want to make invalid.
Sorry,
Yeah,
is this, sorry, just to follow, this is about the sort of cores issue, or what do you mean by encodings? Content types?
Like
Yeah,
JSON
content type,
or
media types, yeah.
okay.
This is about the issue 280 thing we're talking about, or is this something different?
It covers that, but also, like, yeah, more broadly, what should we talk about in terms of security, and should we be more strict?
Because the weird thing about my suggestion on that issue that is a little subtle is that random off the beaten path content types are actually fine. The things that cause the biggest concern are specifically text plain, multi-part form data, and application XWW form auto encoded. If you have made up if you want to send your things via ASN1 or like thrift or whatever, and send that in the content type, then that actually solves the problem. It's just the three things that are the loopholes in the spec that are the problem. So I'm not sure that closing off other encodings is a problem here, because the random encodings are fine.
Yeah, and though that's, sorry, Shane, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, from a user's perspective, we have an application that we specifically are using the multi-part form encoding to get around the cores issue. That is the purpose of why we're using that encoding. And so it's important for us to maintain that, regardless of where the spec goes.
Sorry, what do you mean by get around the cores issue? You mean protect?
Get rid of the pre-flight requests.
Okay,
so performance concerns, we're trying to eliminate the pre-flight request. And the only way to do that is to use the basic HTTP request.
And what
is the
you use to protect your app against CSRF attacks?
Well, it's a public app, doesn't require protection in that sense.
It doesn't use like cookies or for authentication? Okay, yeah, if it doesn't have any authentication, then that's fine.
No, any authentication would be through a JWT, which would then trigger a pre-flight.
So the thing I wanted to mention is, if you don't follow this spec, that doesn't mean that your app will stop working. So if, for example, we forbade all other media types, that just means that your request wouldn't be a GraphQL over HTTP request. But you can still do that request. That's your choice. It just means that it won't necessarily be supported by various servers. Though, David, everything you said is correct, which is, this media type has the special behavior. Thinking about it in terms of longevity, if we later wanted to actually specify multi-part as one of the media types that we support, then the fact that we allowed a may beforehand means that we would have to be incredibly careful in the way in which we introduced the wording around that, so that we don't break the way that other people have already done it with multi-part. Multi-part's quite like loose, right? You could define it in a whole bunch of ways. I've seen people that have done it just by using a fixed divider in the multi-part stream, for example. There's others that use the more traditional like random string approach. There's all sorts of stuff. As a spec, if we're strict on this and we say you must use one of these supported things, then we give ourselves the space to expand in future. If we just say, oh, you may do other things, then expanding into those may be challenging. Interesting problem.
We could simply add a note that to that effect, that if other contents listed here are in use, they may conflict with future additions to the specification or something along those lines. Like,
yeah, I think
not
that's
recommended, but
I think that's a really good point. Shane, would you be interested in literally raising that as a non-normative note in the as a pull request to the main spec as it is currently?
I'll write a note. Sure, I'll see if I can do that.
Fantastic. Did anyone else want to say anything else on the security topic before we move on?
I was just going to say, like, I think it's an interesting point because one of the other non-spec specs, which is essentially the GraphQL upload file upload thingy, and that Jaden had worked on, which is not officially a spec, but it's essentially a spec in the sense of like based on popularity and usage. And there, like for example, multiparts is being used actively. So essentially, if that were to get merged in the future, then what you're talking about in terms of like conflicting usage of the content type might become an actual thing then.
Yeah, the file upload spec is a really good call out, and it's something we would definitely have to put effort into making sure we didn't break if we were to specify multi-part in future, which I'm not sure that we will, to be honest. But if we were to.
I had one last thing, maybe last. We have this Apollo require preflight header to force a preflight, so the opposite of what Shane was saying earlier. Is there some value in specifying this, like GraphQL require preflight or something like this, so that, or maybe make it a may in the language there? So that there is some uniformity in the different implementations, or do we just want to leave it out for everyone to choose whatever they want?
I think that would go really nicely in the non-normative note where it says if you use other media types, then, for example, if you were to use multi-part, then you're going to have potentially issues with cores. You can add a header such as GraphQL force preflight in order to do this, and rather than it being like a spec, like you have to use this, it's just put out there as an option. And I think one of the other things that I've heard is that the X dash headers shouldn't be used anymore. So it would just be GraphQL force preflight or something like that.
Why shouldn't the X dash headers be used anymore?
I think I heard, and treat this like really loosely, but I think I heard that the HTTP specification folks are basically, they're deprecating using that, and they say you should just use whatever the target header should be in the end anyway. I think it's to do with like reducing the migration effort so that people don't have to support the X dash and the non-X dash version of a header when it becomes more official, but I'm not sure. Okay, cool. So I think broadly, this is the final piece of the puzzle of moving this to a stage 3 spec and getting it out there as the official spec. So any help writing the little non-normative notes here and there, putting a little section on security, calling out the most obvious things, or even the subtle things, would be very welcome. Please have a go at as much or as little as that as you would like to do. That would be really great for moving this forwards. Okay, let's move on to persisted operations again. So, as you probably all know, I am very big on persisted operations, persisted documents, trusted documents, stored queries, whatever you want to call them. There are many forms of them. The most common forms are the persisted queries and the automatic persisted queries that exist out there at the moment. I have coined a term trusted documents, which is not meant to be the same thing. It's more a subset of it where you are basically saying, I trust these documents. Like my developers wrote these documents. I trust that they're safe. So they differentiate from stored or persisted in that there is this element of trust as well. Because you could just store an end user's documents and that would still have the network bandwidth improvements, just like APQ does. But the trust is a whole different thing for allow listing. So I've been thinking about this a bit more and also talking with various people. And it seems that one of the common patterns that is out there in the ecosystem for dealing with persisted queries is the URL being something like /GraphQL/hash/operation name. Now, when I wrote up the persisted document spec, I was doing it in the more traditional recommended way that things like Relay, Apollo, GraphQL code generator, and other things have like recommended, which is for Apollo, it's to add it to like the extensions or whatever, but it just goes as part of a regular post to the GraphQL endpoint. Now, the advantage of putting things onto sub URLs, there's quite a few. One is that traditional tooling can understand the query more. So you can do things like caching much more easily without having to have a GraphQL specific cache layer. You can uniquely identify this thing already. And it applies to a whole number of other techniques as well, which hopefully I wrote up somewhere. So I was looking at actually potentially making this the thing that we recommend. So keep in mind, the spec as currently written doesn't forbid you from doing other things. It doesn't forbid you from just using a SHA-256, SHA-1, or an MD5 hash as the identifier. Those will still be recognized as persisted document requests. But what I'm thinking of is in terms of what we recommend people do. And I think if we start to recommend people actually use the subpath solution, then we'll find that many of the complaints that people have, in particular, like even today, I was working on a project and in the network tools, it's just /GraphQL/GraphQL, like encouraging people to put the identifiers into the URLs makes debugging easier. It makes the experience nicer for everyone. It improves tooling. So I'd like to gather your feedback on what you think about this. And in particular, I found that specifying this and specifying a URL such as this one, which I'm going to put into the chat, that will, it's really long. That's the issue. It's really long. Like it expands over the size of the spec-MD rendering.
I'd have one comment on that, and that is mainly that we also then need to specify how we handle variables, because it's already a long URL, and the chance that we exceed URL limits is quite high. So how we do the breaking off, like with the vary header for caching and so on, could be important.
Yeah, I agree. David, you've got a dash shortly. Do you want to comment?
I can give my high level feedback. I feel like it's a little inappropriate to be like, here's what I don't like about it, and now I'm gonna run by. But if that's helpful, so I hope it's taken in good respect. Yeah, this is a complicated thing that a lot of people have implemented in different ways, and it would be great to get to the point where clients that are using a sort of persistive operation are not, out of spec essentially. I think my three reactions to like the spec as written right now, the proposal, which is not what you just stated, so that's fine, is number one, I don't love the concept as shown here of like putting document ID in the top level JSON thing, because while of course one can choose to encode the GraphQL specs like terms any way you want, and we could write a GraphQL over weird HTTP spec where like the query is put in the variables field and the variables are put in the extension fields. Like it's kind of nice that the top level JSON object or query things correspond to the things in the spec. And so it's a little surprising to me that the GraphQL over HTTP spec would add a top level thing next to, request, operation name, and extensions that's just like not one of the things in the GraphQL spec in the corresponding object. So that's a little surprising. I also just at a really high level am curious about the approach that this committee likes to take in general. I think sometimes this committee tries to observe what the implementations out there are, find commonalities, find the things that like 60% of the implementations do, write that down, convince the other 40% to migrate. And this seems more of a like, let's just design a new thing from scratch. And I don't know that that's the most constructive way, as opposed to, sort of going with sort of status quo. Honestly, if I were writing this proposal, what I would write would be like 3 sentences long. It would be like, some a GraphQL over HTTP operation does not need to contain the query field, the query field in the post or parameter. Their servers and clients may have an implementation defined way for the server to learn what the query is based on an extension, header, URL part, or other thing. This can be used to implement persisted queries. If there is another mechanism to get the query, possibly via an ID, then it is still valid, and that would be my entire proposal. I know it doesn't allow for interop, but it's not clear to me that persistent query things really are super interop based anyway.
Yeah, I think that's good feedback. So there's two points there that I want to address. One is why is it top level field? And I think the main reason for that is extensions is explicitly a field that is designed for vendor extension. So we, as the GraphQL Foundation, shouldn't be putting things into extensions because that negates the point of extensions. So everything that we specify shouldn't put stuff in there. Hence, we put it somewhere else, top level field. We actually have the right to do that because we are GraphQL Foundation, so I think it's okay. Also, interestingly, this is what Relay were doing. They were putting it in a top level ID field already, so it is actually reflecting some of the previous use. Secondly, with regard to the complexity of the spec, yes, we have been saying for years, effectively, yeah, you do this, but people don't do it because there's too many questions and there's too many different ways of doing it. So by standardizing one way, we basically say if your server supports persistent operations according to this spec and your client does, then it doesn't matter which vendor each of them are from. They should just basically be able to work. There is still an issue of getting the persisted operations to the server, which is left as an exercise for the reader at the moment, but it is something that we should consider also specifying in a follow-up, I think, at which point potentially that's it. Like any client that you build would just follow the spec for any compliant server and they'll just work, and persisted queries will be really easy. And honestly, it's one of the biggest value gains that you can get in your API. And it's one of the things that people just aren't doing. And I think it's because it's too hard. And if we can make it easier for them by binding the hands of people who are building clients and building servers, I think it might actually be helpful.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I have other thoughts possibly that I should run, but thanks for having me. Sorry to be here for so short, and thanks for reminding me about this, Martin.
Cool. Does anyone else want to give any feedback?
Sure. Now I forgot what I was going to comment on. Now we were talking about the URLs. My comment was that using the URL encoding that you described as you posted the sample I would expect it would always be shorter than the alternative ways to encode a GET request as it exists today. So I don't really think the URL length is a problem compared to what the alternative would be today, because you've taken the query out. You don't have to pass the query in. So the hash should be, and you don't need to write operation name equals or equivalent. So I don't really think the URL length is going to be a problem compared to the alternative today. And I like the sample as presented. Side note, I do like the document ID as the root field, my opinion.
So that last comment, were you saying put the operation name before the hash? Is that what you're saying?
No. I was saying my side comment was that I do like the document ID as a root field in the JSON when you're posting.
Oh, right. As a reply to what David said. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So in terms of request size, as in like number of bytes, yeah, you're right. Like this is smaller than it would have been otherwise. My concerns are more aesthetic, as in like that's a long URL to look at. And also I mentioned before the issue of like looking at this in the developer tooling and seeing /GraphQL is not particularly helpful, but seeing /GraphQL a really long string and then the thing I actually care about, like /friend names on the end, is also not ideal. Like friend names is probably the thing I care about more. But we have to allow for the fact that because this is persisted documents, not persisted operations, a document may have one or more operations. And if it has one, that operation may be anonymous. So we would need to handle the case of an anonymous. That said, we can do that easily with just like // or something like that. So maybe I would be happier with it if we just put the operation name first. The reason I didn't do that is because it's not what the people that I've seen talking about this do. And I wanted to reflect the patterns that I already see out in the ecosystem. But I don't know, it would be nice. The whole SHA 256 like prefix is a new thing anyway. So I guess we're partially opting into behaviors.
Yeah, and I think that, as programmers, people will logically think of, like in C# optional parameters go at the end, well, any language pretty much, right? So, even if, like you're saying, it's actually more logical to put the name first. On the other hand, I would consider the fact that there's probably some developers or developer teams probably rarely use operation names. I know my dev teams have never used one ever. As many operations they have in their front end clients, they've never used operation names ever. And some other development teams might be inclined to have one document with many operations in it, and so it might vary a little bit based on the team. I'm just guessing.
A server implementation could also shorten that SHA-256, right? Like the GitHub URLs, if you don't want the long one. You can be smart and return to the client a short version of the checksum, of the hash.
I was sorely tempted to do this. I actually looked into it, and it seems that if you literally cut an SHA 256 in half, it's not thought to be any more insecure than literally the fact that you've removed half of the, well, I say half of the entropy, half of the bits. Like it's not weaker just because you've only taken the first half. So I did consider just truncating it, and that would probably be fine. Like the chance of conflicts is so low. But I thought, nah, that's a whole thing we'd have to argue and justify. And for the sake of reducing, the number of bytes by number of characters, sorry, by like 32 or whatever it is, I didn't bother in the end.
Do we expect most implementation to like have, I don't know how to say it, but isolated clients and server? Because there is also a world where the client sends a document to the server and gets back an ID. And in that case, the server can ensure there is no collision and return very short IDs. You see what I mean? Like we don't have to
Yeah,
bind to SHA-256.
absolutely. So the point of the SHA-256 is to try and enable this like automatic interoperability.
Yeah.
So the idea is a client can generate it and already has the codes. And then when it sends it to the server will just be able to go, yeah, they match what I would have done anyway, and it's fine. And we know that it's probably unique because there's a very low chance of collisions. Of course, someone's going to start looking for the collision for the introspection query or something like that, whatever. But yeah, like generally it should be fine. But as you say, if you're doing it more of a coordinated way where you send it to the server and then you get the hashes back, then absolutely, you could just use an incrementing counter at that point. That would be fine. And that would still work according to this. You just wouldn't put SHA-256 blah in there. You just put like, iOS 1.3.7-17 or whatever.
Where I'm going is maybe we should make this the default or the recommendation, like have a coordination, because then you can have short URLs and everything. So it's much more nicer.
I also kind of agree with that in the sense that I'm trying to think, or maybe I'm not thinking about it properly, but like I'm trying to think of a situation where multiple servers would need to interrupt for persistent documents in the sense of where like the SHA-256 verification would then be useful, if that makes sense.
So it's intended as a way for example, your front end, your iOS developers, they build their iOS app and then they build their bundle of trusted documents, and they can start putting their app through testing or whatever before the server even knows what this bundle is, because it doesn't need it yet. It just needs it before it starts receiving requests. So it's to enable all your different teams to coordinate without the server having to be, awake and responding to that persist request. Otherwise, the server going down would also break your app build process, which I guess isn't like the end of the world, but like why tie things together if we don't need to was basically the intent behind it. That said, one of the things I have been considering is like, should we standardize the way of persisting operations? And I've got a number of thoughts on that as well, but we've only got 5 minutes left, so I won't go into them now.
30-second comment here is just, I feel like without the tooling existing, there's no particular incentive for a developer really to use the SHA-256. I already log, in mine, I log it per request. It finds a match in the database and it logs an ID for that request. I just use the query ID. I already have that, Once the tooling is available, then having that standard, whether it be the 256 or half of it or whatever the standard is, that's where that becomes really valuable, because now you have a standard tooling. and other people have done tooling. So I think that will come into its element after the next piece. After the tuning.
I broadly agree with you. Like this would be laying the path for the tooling to exist.
Right.
But also, like if you don't use SHA 256, that's fine. Like it's totally fine
Right.
to just use your own identifiers. Okay, so just to round this one out, because we've only got a couple of minutes left, how do people feel in general about my proposal, which is that we push to recommending using some kind of URL-based system for identifying the persisted queries, and also for the get version of them, encouraging the use of, sorry, the get version, the query version of them, encouraging the use of get rather than post.
You mean for everything or just specifically for the persisted documents in terms of the gets to query?
Yeah, just persisted documents.
As a recommendation, I like the recommendation. It's important to not be required for like, WebSockets and stuff, but I think it's reasonable.
Cool. Okay. Well, that means it does justify me spending more time on it. So I will keep working away at that. Fantastic. Thank you for the input. Is there any last thing that anyone would like to say? We've got about 2 minutes left. No. All right. Fantastic. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here and for this excellent discussion. And if you want to attend a future one, add yourself as an attendee. If it's only me in there, then that probably means that the meeting won't be going ahead. But yeah, if you have interesting things, add them to the agenda, and then we can have more discussions. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Catch you next time.
Thank you, everyone.